Alonso was awesome, Mercedes melted, and Ferrari flopped this weekend in Brazil, so I asked you for your hottest takes from the 2023 Sao Paulo Grand Prix, and they were as close to the edge as Perez and Alonso's finish. Fabian starts us off saying the fight between Perez and Alonso was one for the ages. I absolutely loved it. It was one of those battles that you rarely get in Formula One, where either driver could have feasibly come out on top, and the margins between them were so fine. But the reason it worked so well is you had two drivers that both trusted one another completely and knew exactly what they were doing behind the wheel. Both drivers were absolutely desperate for this podium, by the way. I think the narrative adds to it even more. The fact that Alonso was trying to show that Aston Martin aren't a sinking ship that recently he'd been rumoured to jump off of, and Sergio Perez was trying to show that he is good enough to retain that second Red Bull seat and claim second in the Drivers' Championship. It was just perfect. Harmon says Lando Norris didn't deserve driver of the day. It should have been Alonso. Even as a McLaren fan, I have to agree with you on this. Fernando Alonso definitely deserved driver of the day. The problem was that Alonso's most exciting moments came on the final 2 laps of the Grand Prix when most people had already cast their vote. And the fact that Alonso's defensive performance for that final podium spot is up there with some of the best defensive driving you will ever see. I mean, it was ridiculous. The way that he dropped in behind Perez for that final lap at turn 1 so as to give himself that slingshot down towards turn 4 was absolutely sublime racing from the Spaniard, and it's the kind of driving that you get from the most experienced Formula One driver ever that is still somehow at the top of his game. Michael said it's a shame that Lance's best weekend of the year will be overshadowed by everything else that happened. I think the biggest positive for Lance Stroll in all of this is he had a great race and we didn't see him. You know when you don't see Max Verstappen on the coverage, it's because he won comfortably? The same for Lance Stroll here. We didn't get to see him during the race because he drove really well. His best qualifying of the season started ahead of Fernando Alonso. Okay, neither Aston Martin was quick off the grid either time that we had a standing start, but he made 5th place his own early on, drove comfortably to the finish, and reminded us why he is still in Formula One. It's easy to tar him with that pay driver brush, but it's also easy to get kicked out of Formula One if you're not good enough. Nicholas Latifi and Nikita Mazepin had infinite money behind them, but they were kicked out. There is a driver there with Lance Stroll. We just don't see that driver often enough. David, though, brings Aston Martin back down to earth. Aston Martin's development is a headless chicken. Reverting to a start-of-the-year spec and comfortably being back at the front of the grid is extremely strange, to put it mildly. This is definitely the only negative from Aston Martin this weekend, but it is quite a big negative. I mean, the AMR23 was probably 3rd or 4th quickest on pure pace, and as much as they had their best qualifying of the year and their best points haul in a very long time, when it comes to the weekend, they removed a lot of their upgrades from that car, which goes to show that the Aston Martin team are still very much confused about that car concept, and they need to understand the car before we go into the winter break, or it could be disastrous going into 2024. Josh says Lando is easily the 2nd fastest on the grid right now and can take it to Max if McLaren had a bit better race pace. Possible title challenge next season for McLaren. Norris said himself it's as close as it gets to a perfect weekend for McLaren. However, considering the Friday qualifying, I would argue not. I mean, it's becoming a bit of a pattern with Lando Norris that he doesn't quite qualify where he should be. I'm thinking Qatar, I'm thinking Mexico. However, this time around it wasn't his fault as the team put him towards the back of the pack as the rain started to come down, and once again he did redeem himself come Sunday. I completely agree that he's the 2nd best driver on the grid right now. He is by far and away the closest to taking a win off Max Verstappen, but until he starts to get his qualifying right and that elusive first victory actually happens, I'm holding off on the title challenger talks. Unnamed says Ferrari's hydraulics just cost them P2 in the Constructors. It's a tale as old as time, a song as old as rhyme, a Ferrari DNF. Another Ferrari, or more specifically Charles Leclerc, mechanical problem, just as things are starting to look good. I mean, it's unlikely that he would have held on to that 2nd place in the race. The Ferrari had a few cooling problems in the sprint, and Sainz wasn't incredibly quick, but I reckon Charles Leclerc would have probably been a little bit quicker than that. But the fact, again, that Mercedes have had a bad weekend and Ferrari aren't there to capitalize on it is ridiculous. Qatar, Austin, and now again in Brazil, Mercedes have messed up their own race and Ferrari haven't been able to make meaningful gains in the championship. It's just starting to get so frustrating. Michael says Leclerc needs to get out of Ferrari before it psychologically ruins him. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I saw Charles Leclerc in the wall, my first instinct was that he made a mistake, which I know is incredibly harsh, but he does have a mistake in him. However, it was entirely the car this time around. He had an engine problem which locked the rear wheels, so there was nothing he could do about it, and as soon as that Ferrari went off the track, it was destined to go into the wall. But I completely agree that the Ferrari lifestyle must be killing Charles Leclerc from the inside. I mean, all he can scream about after hitting the wall is just how unlucky he has been this season. And we have to remember, this guy took an engine penalty 2 races into the season, and every time it's looked like it's going to get better for Charles Leclerc, he just gets punched in the face all over again, and this boy just cannot catch a break. Gucky? Maybe? Mercedes is sometimes too much pro-Lewis and doesn't act with George in a fair way. Yes, he's annoying sometimes, but Mercedes owe George the same as Lewis. Firstly, I think we have to start with the fact that this was somehow Mercedes' worst race of the season, and I'd like to remind you that they started with the 0 pod for the first 6 races of 2023. It was mind-bogglingly bad. And I mean, I think they were worried about the ride height because of what happened in Austin, but still, it was terrible. And I think Mercedes had the right to give Lewis Hamilton the advantage to a point. Like, considering Lewis Hamilton has been on fire recently, but I agree, they should have swapped them eventually, with George being considerably quicker for a few laps in a row. Although, let's face it, the car was undrivable, the setup was killing the tyres, and both drivers ended up looking hopeless anyway. Although on that point, Michael says Russell really needs to work on his race management. His engineers told him to increase his management, reduce temperatures, but he ignored this and kept pushing. In the end, he cooked his power unit and had to retire. He also had overheating issues in Austin and Mexico. It is staggering what a difference a year can make. Last season, he was winning his first Grand Prix with Mercedes, beating Lewis Hamilton in the standings, and now we jump forward to 2023, and it's a lackluster DNF from George Russell. I agree, though, that this attitude is something we've been seeing from George Russell in recent weeks, and he's just almost desperate to prove something that isn't really there. He's constantly pushing for pace, which he doesn't seem to actually have, and as you said, that's then killing his strategy a lot of the time, and in the case of this weekend, killing his car as well. Finishing off with a couple of hot takes from me. First and foremost, Alpine saved what looked to be a terrible weekend for the French team. Both cars looked like they had just enough pace to squeak through to Q2 in both qualifying sessions, had Esteban Ocon not crashed into Fernando Alonso, but they never looked like they were going to trouble the top 10. I mean, their sprint pace was pretty awful, and it looked like the race was set to be a disaster. But in a turn of events for Alpine, whose reliability is not known to be great, they won the war of attrition and got both cars into the points. Gasly in particular has looked really quick during this triple header, and I think there's a lot of positives for Alpine at the moment, which doesn't feel very Alpine. And finally from me, the battle for AlphaTauri supremacy is not over with 2 races to go. I do have to say, I think Yuki Tsunoda was very good this weekend. I mean, Tsunoda is the one that comes away from it with a double points finish, and having out-qualified Daniel Ricciardo in both sessions, it looks very, very good, which will likely also see him finish ahead of Daniel Ricciardo in the standings, considering he has 13 points to Danny's 6 with 2 races to go. But if a couple of things went Daniel Ricciardo's way, I think they would have been right on top of each other. And I'm really interested to see how these two would go wheel to wheel with one another, because Daniel Ricciardo's pace was good and very similar to Tsunoda's, so I think it would have been a really interesting battle. The problem being that he was a lap down after the restart because he got hit by debris. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, I also made this video here about my thoughts on the rookies that may be making their way into Formula 1 soon. So click that link and I'll see you over there.